I am always open to learning from you guys. And I had a comment from a viewer asking me, why do UNT Muslims and Jews eat pork if all three faiths trace their history back to Abraham? In Leviticus, God says, "You shall not eat the flesh of pigs, for they are an abomination." And later in Deuteronomy it says, "These are the animals you may eat. Among the animals that are on the earth, you may eat these. Whatever parts with the hoof completely and choose the cut among the animals you may eat." In Mark 7, Jesus said, "It is not what goes into a man that makes him unclean, but what comes out of his mouth." Some Jewish people thought that Gentiles couldn't be trusted because they weren't Jewish. He saw all kinds of animals, some considered clean and some unclean. Before this, Jewish people had many rules about what foods were clean, but after Peter's dream, those rules didn't seem as important. Now, anyone could become a follower of Jesus, no matter what they ate. Then a voice said, "Do not call anything common or unclean. We have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have gained access to this grace and are being saved. And we stand in awe at the hope of the glory of God." Here, Paul teaches that our faith in Jesus allows us to have peace with God. We are no longer separated from God because of our actions or food choices. Rather, we are saved by God's grace alone. Second, because they believe that following Jesus is more important than following Old Testament laws. Let's end with a story about a rabbi, a priest, and a pastor who were friends. They often talked about their faith and how their traditions were similar and different. One day they decided to have a dinner together. The rabbi brought kosher food, the priest brought halal food, and the pastor made sure to have plenty of food that everyone could eat. During dinner, they discussed why they chose certain foods and what those foods meant to them. They talked about how their traditions helped them connect with God and their ancestors. They also talked about how these traditions sometimes caused problems, but how they tried to understand each other's points of view. They see the Old Testament as pointing towards Jesus and his teachings, not as a set of rules to follow exactly. This dream showed Peter that God didn't want people to be separated because of food. It didn't matter if someone ate pork or not. However, it's essential to understand that these teachings don't discard the Old Testament. It also shows that Christians can choose to eat pork without causing offense. Food is a big part of our culture and faith, and it can be hard to understand why other people have different beliefs and practices. But it can also be a chance to learn and grow, just like the rabbi, the priest, and the pastor. We can learn to respect each other's traditions and see how our faiths are similar and different. This can help us become better friends and neighbors. They reinterpret its meaning. Christians continue to believe that the Old Testament was inspired by God, but they see Jesus as the ultimate fulfillment of its promises. What mattered was that they loved God and trusted in Jesus. Couldn't we just decide on our own what's clean and unclean? Well, the Bible does teach us about personal responsibility and making our own decisions, but it also talks about something called conscience. Our conscience helps us know what is right and wrong, and it's important to consider how our actions affect others. But Jesus didn't think like that. He saw everyone as needing to put their trust in God. Many Jewish and Muslim people would feel uncomfortable because eating pork is a big part of their faith. In his letter to the Corinthians, Paul wrote, "I have the right to do anything you say, but not everything is beneficial. I have the right to do anything, but not everything is constructive. I have the right to do anything, but I will not do anything that amounts to sin, so that nobody will ever have cause to stumble, so that my ministry and my preaching will not be hindered in any way." Here, Paul reminds us that just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. We need to think about others and how our actions might affect their faith. So even though Christians are free to eat pork, they should also be respectful of other people's feelings. We should remember that food is not just about what we eat, but it's also about our relationship with God and other people. It is He who speaks evil things, such as murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, and blasphemy. But I show that those who are under another law, whose foundation is not the law, but faith in Jesus Christ. Here, Paul tells us that Jesus didn't come to abolish the Old Testament law, but to fulfill it. Those who put their faith in Jesus are not bound by the same laws as those who do not believe. We are free to make choices based on love, not rules. Here, Jesus is saying that it's not the food that makes us unclean, it's our thoughts and actions. Just as a shadow shows the body it represents, the law showed what was to come, Jesus himself. Once Jesus came, his followers didn't need to follow all the laws in the Old Testament anymore. They now had Jesus, who took away the power of sin and death. What comes out of our mouths shows what's in our hearts. Pigs meet the first part of the requirement, having divided hooves, but they do not meet the second, chewing cud. It's a great question, and one that delves into the very core of our respective faiths. So let's unpack it together. Let's start with the Old Testament, which both Jews and Christians consider sacred. But why? Why did God single out pigs and make them unclean? It says, "He has forbidden you only what is dead and blood, and pork, and what is to Muslims, eating halal, or lawful food is a way of keeping themselves pure. It's not just about what goes into their stomachs, but it's also about keeping their minds and bodies ready to worship God at all times. By avoiding pork, they show that they are submitting to God's will and that they are obedient to His word. It's a sign of their faith. I believe it's because he wanted to set his people apart, to show that they belonged to God and were different from the nations around them. If everyone was eating pork, there wouldn't have been any special dietary markers showing who followed God. God gave the Israelites a visible sign to distinguish them from other cultures. When they obeyed this command, they showed the world that they belonged to God. They were holy. For Jews, these dietary laws, kashrut, are still an important part of life. Even after 2,000 years of exile from their land, these laws are a way of maintaining their identity and separating themselves from other cultures. Even when they were persecuted and scattered, they could still follow these laws and know that they were still God's people. Now let's look at Islam. The Quran clearly states that pork is forbidden. So why did Jesus change this law? When Jesus taught this, he was spending time with both Jews and Gentiles, people from different cultures. After Jesus rose from the dead, one of his followers, Peter, had a dream. This dream changed how Peter and other early Christians saw things. In his letter to the Galatian church, Paul wrote, "I have not abolished the law or the commandments of God." Paul understood the Old Testament law as pointing forward to Jesus. In his letter to the Romans, Paul says, "Therefore, by this act of righteousness, being justified by his faith," many Christians read passages like these as Jesus abolishing the Old Testament dietary laws. Some people might argue that if God doesn't care about pork anymore, then why should we? Imagine if everyone started eating pork because they believed it wasn't forbidden anymore. If we want to live in unity with other Christians, we should avoid causing division over food. Overall, Christians eat pork for two main reasons. First, because Jesus taught that what we eat doesn't make us holy, and that's why Christians eat pork. This story shows that Christians can respect and understand why Jewish and Muslim people don't eat pork. And if you want to learn more about the faith, check out this playlist with more videos about Christianity. Thank you for watching.